This is our final panel of the day, and I really look at it as an opportunity to summarize and to actually extend a lot of the points we discussed earlier today in all the panels and keynotes. First of all, this doesn't happen often. I want to just spend 15 seconds thanking Catherine before we see a lot of folks begin to, pick up suitcases and so forth and briefcases. So hats off to Catherine Lotrianti for another great conference. So let me begin by just talking a little bit about context for this panel. And really this one is going to be a conversation that'll start here, but I'm going to quickly bring in all of you because I think we all learn from each other as we move forward. So we've gone through a variety of keynotes and panels. All of them, I think, touched the topic of deterrence in some way or another. Senator Whitehouse and his concept of looking at new initiatives in the private sector with active defense could be seen as an element of a deterrence construct. Melissa Hathaway's panel in looking at cyber readiness is certainly foundational to elements of resilience that sometimes we think about inside of deterrence. We think about the other keynotes, Director Comey's comments really ranged wide. I thought it was a great presentation, but elements in there, the role of law enforcement in deterrence really played out loud and clear. So what we're going to try to do is not just repeat, but build on those points from this morning. And so let me start by talking about what this panel is entitled and what that means, just by way of context again. Deterring malicious activity in cyberspace. So I think the what is really important, and others on this panel will frame it up. We'll do some introductory remarks. But think about, don't think about one element, one aspect. Some, based on their experiences, will think about espionage, some will think about crime, some will think about conflict, others will think about specific threat actors. We're going to talk about all that, but we're going to try to frame it in a way that makes sense. Then what does it mean drives you into how, right? What are we talking about? And really in the end game, it's the idea of getting into the psychology of an adversary and either imposing some type of cost that makes them get to a point where they see that the actions they're about to take are not going to achieve the benefit. It is about the idea of denying benefit as well. But it really is this idea of trying to affect the adversary's calculus over time. So today, what we're going to try to do now is build out some national perspectives and some experiences of these expert panelists that kind of draws all of that together. We'll start with Dean Cheng, and Dean, as many of you probably know, has been studying the nation of China for some time. Dean has a significant amount of experience in both the think tank world as well as in business as an analyst. And so we'll start with just sharing a bit of perspective about China, where it is today, how it thinks about deterrence, and kind of the way ahead for them. Gene?
Well, good afternoon. Again, my thanks as well to Professor Lotriant for the chance to be here. Listening to the various remarks today, China has come up quite a bit, as it usually does when it comes to cyber issues. What I would suggest, however, in trying to frame this discussion is that the problem for the US and China with regards to cyber deterrence is not that we have asymmetric points of view, because asymmetries tend to be the product of having similar starting points and different approaches. And what I would suggest instead is that the two countries have orthogonal points of view. That is, if we think of it from a plane perspective, the two really intersect perhaps almost not at all. And what this comes down to is what I would term the four knots of US-Chinese cyber and deterrence issues. The four knots being one, China does not see deterrence as we do. The very term weice, which we translate and the Chinese translate as deterrence, incorporates for the Chinese both the concept of dissuasion but also coercion, a point of view that is specifically rejected by people like Schelling and Brody and other leading lights of Western thinking about deterrence. Also, China is not necessarily interested in deterring in cyber. That is, the Chinese are not focused about deterring other people from doing things in cyberspace, preventing cyber attacks per se, but rather through cyber. That is, like nuclear, like space, like conventional deterrence, the Chinese are going to use deterrence via a cyber methodology to achieve larger terrestrial objectives. That goes to the second aspect, which is that China does not see cyber as we do. Cyber, for us, is almost an arena, a domain in and of itself. China views cyber as part of the larger informational arena. Information in every sense, including the cognitive, how information is absorbed, interpreted, and acted upon. And so political warfare is seen as part of information warfare alongside cyber, or more accurately in the Chinese term, network warfare. Third is that China doesn't see information necessarily as we do. From the Chinese perspective, we now live in the information age. As good Marxist-Leninists, China sees the methods of production as influencing society and economics and ultimately affecting warfare. And so the information age has altered the key strategic resource to information, whereas in the industrial age, it was industry, and in the feudal age, it was literally human manpower. Also, China views information as much as a bane as a boon. Information can constitute a threat to regime survival. There is a reason the Chinese have gone to great lengths to make sure that all of these social media corporations in China are in fact Chinese corporations. Why Twitter and YouTube and other things are very hard to access in China. And a third part to this is that information is now seen as the key to winning what the Chinese term local wars under informationized conditions. That is how the Chinese describe current and for the future, the nature of warfare, informationized warfare. And that, by the way, requires extensive peacetime preparation and information collection. So at least some of what we see today is not simply making money or being obnoxious. It is intelligence preparation of the battlefield. And this leads us to the last and perhaps most important knot. China does not see the strategic situation as we do. For China, the issue is home games, whether it is the South China Sea, which is China's front yard, or whether it is information space within China. This is for China a matter of national priority, national survival. For the United States, these are in some ways away games. The South China Sea is not our front yard or backyard. Politically speaking, we are talking about American allies as opposed to necessarily the United States itself. China, of course, doesn't have too many allies, so it also doesn't have to worry about extended deterrence in space, in cyber, in conventional capabilities, whereas the United States does. And so in this regard, we also do have an asymmetric interests problem because China can achieve its goals, its desired goals, without having to strike at the United States, for example, on the issue of Taiwan. Whereas for the United States, if China is launching an incursion against the Senkakus or the South China Sea, the Philippines or Taiwan, then the US finds itself directly engaged with the PRC.
Thanks very much, Dean. We're going to come back to China here in about, after we finish with the opening remarks here, but some really interesting insights. You think about the last point that Dean made, China looking inward, but now really looking outward as it expands globally. The United States typically looking abroad, but now based on 9/11 and other issues, really focused on the homeland. How do we connect in that space? How do we deter, but also how do we begin a dialogue? Okay, so let's go to Wang Yi on the Korean side, perspective from South Korea, both a national perspective, and then just some thoughts about the calculus as you see it on the North Korean side.
Hey, it's great to be here in the United States, and thank you for having me here as a panelist. And this talk that we are going to have is on the preventing malicious activities even before happening. And how do you prevent anything that's going to happen in the future? It's collecting information, analyzing it, and put it into indicators, and talk to the counterparts or threat agents, and stop, deter anything that's going to happen in the future. And today, when we talked about all these discussions, I have heard a lot of vocabularies: North Korea, and deterrence, and active of defense. And in that terms, I'm going to talk about North Korea. And North Korea is least known country and most unpredictable country and very closed nation. And the South Korea, we are still in a war with North Korea since we are in an armistice. Korean War has not ended yet. And North Korea is constantly looking at the opportunity and time to attack, undermine our infrastructures. And if you look at the indications, when we have indications, and when I was serving in the military, when we have indications, we raise the warning levels. And when we have indications, we went into the deterrences, and if deterrence fails, we initiate upland, blah, blah, blah. But in the cyberspaces, when we have, it's really hard to collect all that information. It's time-consuming, and resources and systems and human resources that we have to invest into collecting information and analyzing it. And even if we have it in indicators, we have no counterparts to talk to. And when we look at it in an asymmetric warfare perspective, North Korea has everything to gain, and South Korea has everything to lose. And in that perspective, North Korea is not going to give up on nuclear bomb, and they're not going to give up on advantages in cyber attacks. And we are continuously to see threats from North Korea. And how do we prevent something that never happened before? And I was thinking about it. Everything that we do in cybersecurity and that matches with the preventing side. So there are a couple of things that Korean government has implemented. One is to put all the e-government system into one government data center. In the past, all the ministries and agencies, local governments, they had their own network, their systems and servers, and they did not have the budgets or expertise, human resources to manage it properly, and there was weaknesses for North Korea to explore. And we had put all that systems into one data center. We started in this project in 2005, and we have invested about $1 billion, and we have had a breakpoint in 2009 in ROI perspective, and at the end of 2014, we had more than $1 billion budgets saved. And also, we have eliminated all the servers and network systems that are exposed in the internet. And second thing that we had done is to improve private companies. We have 3 different categories. One is critical information infrastructures that are very critical for the people. And they have to go through security vulnerability assessment and develop a security plan and submit it to the governments and had an approval from the Prime Minister. Second group is the lesser important than the critical infrastructures, but those companies that has about more than 10 million sales in ICT sector or using ICT technologies, they have to go through information security management system, which is similar to ISO 27001. And these companies are mandated to receive certificates. Otherwise, they have to pay penalties for it. And we are trying to expand that to health and education and financial sectors. And we are working with those ministries at the moment. And all the other companies, they are recommended to go through cybersecurity preparation systems. It's mandatory. It's similar to ISMS that I just talked about, but it's less rigorous. And working with public and private partnerships, we have created a CTOS, Cyber Threat Analysis Sharing System. And we have currently about 109 companies that are member of the system. We are currently sharing, we have categorized these companies to share different informations with different group of companies. And we started in 2014, and at the moment, it's just one-way communications. Companies do not provide enough information for us to share them, so that we wanted to adopt point systems. So if they do not participate enough, they are going to put on a waiting list or something. So they have to put information in there in order to receive those informations. And those are the kind of things that we are working on at the moment, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop right now. Thank you.
Wang Yi, we'll come back to some of these points. Great initiatives on the part of the South Koreans with regards to the data center piece and resiliency, thinking about information sharing. But I would like to come back to the idea of how do you deter unpredictable actors? I mean, what? And we'll hold that question and we'll come back to it later on. So now we're going to go over to the European side. We've got two different perspectives from Scandinavian countries. Lars Nicander and Jarno Limnéll will talk from their own national perspectives, but then also give us a view into how they see things over in Russia. So Lars, why don't you start?
Thank you, Bob, and thanks for inviting me here. I will try to put our thinking in Sweden in the context here with a kind of background for you. Sweden, together with Finland and Estonia, is among the most IT-connected countries in the world. And we had early came on in the mid-90s, started to focusing about the vulnerabilities in the information society. We followed the Marsh Commission here and the PD 62, 63, and tried to see how could that work with us. What kind of lessons did we have to take home? And when that happened, some European countries thought this was a hype really about electronic Pearl Harbor in the US, but we didn't feel it that way in Europe because there were some differences. KONUS was never threatened from the Soviets on the infrastructure, while we, countries in the near of the Soviet Union, felt that kind of threat, so we built up redundancies within our infrastructure. Sweden and many Nordic countries had all the total defense concept, where the civilian and military part and industrial critical infrastructure was very interconnected with this total defense concept. So we were a little bit calmer up in our area. It was also kind of mentality. Unfortunately, this heritage was a little bit dissolved during the strategic timeout here. But now, it's when the Russian threat feels more closer to us, we start to rebuild the total defense concept 2.0. Unfortunately, the resources and the companies which were government-owned or controlled are today outsourced, and we don't have the platforms as we used to have, but it's a little bit lessons lost, so we try to get that those kind of principles back with a public-private partnership. For example, you could have companies, government actors, to tell a power grid, you say you want, you have 95% service level agreement, that's your business optimum. From national security standpoint, we want to have to 98%, and we're willing to pay for that. Fine, they said, but hey, you're gaining that, let's bargain. And then you had the difference between 95 and 98%, and you had a win-win situation made and go the extra mile to prepare for situation which outside our business optimum or threats they can't perceive. It's just the National Intelligence Agency. These kinds of models are coming back in our thoughts. I said that the Russian threat is for real, and we see it with this asymmetric warfare kind of campaigns. You have the energy weapon, the finance weapon, the trade weapon, corruption. If you see it in Europe, where the old active measures style from the former KGB are used. And they mix this with cyber attacks, influence operation, net trolls, and military intimidation. We had one case here in the last fall of 2013, a small cyber attack on one city council south of Stockholm and one on the railroad agency in southern Sweden. Not significant, but no fuss. But the interesting thing was that the only media who reported that was Russia Today in Oslo the day after. The finger in the belly. So we see these kind of incidents all the time. Sweden was also very, during in the 90s when this was in the development phase about computer network operations, very early out and said, okay, we can't rule out in principle, offensive use of that as a mean of national survival. And the interesting thing, we even had the traditional Pacific Green Party with us, because then it was computer network attacks. No bombs, no bayonets, no bullets. It's a kind of romantic view. They didn't have seen all the phases of that. But that made us also, we even got a parliament decision that under UN auspices, CNA could be used to competent countries to uphold sanctions, Article 41 in UN Charter and stuff like that. And we had a parliament decision that was quite early on. Unfortunately, we also were very eager on cyber norms and can we build fish webs in the cyberspace and this holy grail of can you have near real-time tracebacks, international rules of engagement for that. And it's this kind of thing, as we heard, seems a little bit gloomy today. So we started also to look on the non-sexy side of this with a bottom-up approach. Education, information insurance education to create a chief information insurance officer during the government to raise the information insurance bar together with the technical cyber defense exercises. And that's the important thing. You can have lots of tabletop exercises, shuffling papers around, but if you don't know what to decide on, it's no use. So this is not so highlighted in the media, but it's slowly creating resilience, which I think you can't cut in corners here. You must deal with that. And we invite to those courses the private sector, the military, and civilian government as well, but very much the local communities and constituency counties, because they have lousy information assurance capacities these days. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. We're going to come back to many of those points. I'd really like to get back to that idea of your perceptions of Russia and poking at Sweden, poking at others, and how do we discriminate, how do we understand better what they're doing and signaling and other activities. Okay, Jarno.
Thank you very much, Bob, and also I have to say that very nice to be here, actually for two reasons. First of all, primarily in Europe, we still consider cyber from the technological point of view, and we don't have this kind of high-level strategic thinking cyber conferences, not so many in Europe, so this is also very good lessons learned for us to be here in the United States. As a professor of the cybersecurity, I have to say that the most valuable skills in cybersecurity in coming years will not concentrate on specific technology, but ability to understand the big picture. And we are early stages in that. And my second good point to be here today, what makes me happy is to sit next to my Swedish colleague, because it was just yesterday when the Finland won Sweden in the ice hockey junior finals, and we won the world championship. Sorry for you.
Do we need to separate? Do we need to sit on this table?
Sorry, Lars, I have to say that.
Assault.
But to get a little bit more serious, I think from the Finland's point of view, when we are talking about the cybersecurity nowadays and cyber deterrence, and especially Russia, we have to put this in the right context. In Finland, as you know, located just next to Russia, cybersecurity and hybrid warfare issues are very topical at the moment. And as you know, the tensions, especially in the Baltic Sea area, has increased during last year. In general, I would describe the current security situation as unpredictable instability, which seems to be the new normal insecurity, at least in the northern part of Europe. In Finland, which is, like Lars mentioned, one of the most digitalized countries in the world, our first cybersecurity strategy was published a little bit over 3 years ago. And actually our vision, which is stated in this strategy, is pretty bold. We are trying to be a global forerunner in cyber threat preparedness and also in managing the disturbances caused by cyber threats. And also we are openly stating, according to the strategy, that our defense forces is creating a comprehensive cyber defense capability, which means capabilities of cyber defense, cyber intelligence, and readiness for proactive measures. I see also that these statements, what we are openly saying in strategy and by our politicians, these are part of our cyber deterrence. We are telling openly what we say and what we are planning to do also in the concrete level. I would also say, even if this comes from the Finn, that our general readiness and strategic understanding, meaning cyber politics, is in a good level in Finland at the moment. And many elements what our cyber deterrence actually share the same principles than our deterrence in the physical world. But I would emphasize 3 key elements when we are talking about the cyber deterrence in Finland. And not concentrating now on resilience, the challenge of the attribution, different means to response. I think we are all sharing that kind of challenges. But first of all, I think when we are talking about deterrence, also in cyber, we too often forget that spirit is always stronger than the sword. I mean the mental dimension of the cyber. And that is something what I find very valuable when I'm thinking about the future of my country and my country's security. Our people's will to defend our country. Referring to the several international studies and surveys, Finns have exceptional high will to defend our country. And this is something what we are really paying attention also to keep in this high level. Because this goes to my second point, which is that, as we very well know, the most valuable asset what you can have in cybersecurity and cyber defense are skilled people. Our strong advantage in Finland is that we have these talented men and women with strong national spirit. And since there is a compulsory conscription in Finland for all men, our society is able to make a natural connection with these talented individuals. And I think this is integral part of our cyber deterrence also. My third point is a little bit similar, but a little bit better also than in Sweden. We have this unique, comprehensive...
No beer afterwards.
I will offer you. We have this, I would say, worldwide unique, comprehensive security of society model, what we have been creating since the Second World War. Practically, this means very active and close cooperation between the different governmental agencies, private sector, and other actors of society. I would recommend you to look at our PPP model. What I think what you are trying, for example, here in the United States, when I was reading your cyber deterrence strategy. You are trying to reach this so-called whole of government or whole of nation approach. That's what we call comprehensive approach to security in Finland. Then my last point concentrates on Russia. First, I have to say that it has been interesting from the European point of view to follow how the US intelligence community has during last 6 months publicly started to tell much stronger position what the cyber threat is against your country. And especially, like, for example, James Clapper has said many times that the cyber threat from Russia is more severe than you have previously assessed it. I see, as my opinion, in this rhetoric, some overestimating on Russia's cyber capabilities. However, I estimate that Russia is one of the top 3 cyber countries in the world. On the other hand, from the Russian point of view, they say that they are trying to prevent any conflict in cyberspace, and the United States is seeing as pushing arms race in this area. My 3 very short points of Russia when evaluating cyber and deterrence. First of all, we have to take into consideration that Russia holds plenty of excellent hackers which are capable to create and use very advanced cyber attack methods. The issue is that most of these hackers are not working for the governments. They are working in criminal groups, proxy groups, but they are working with close cooperation with the government. Second point, lately we have been hearing public comments from Russia concerning about their cyber capabilities. They are more openly telling how much they are putting resources to develop their cyber capabilities, how they are creating their cyber command, or how there is ongoing a big headhunt in Russia at the moment. And I think these statements, pretty strong statements, are part of their cyber deterrence. And my last point concerning about Russia is that looking at Russia, how they are acting at the moment, what they are actually doing, I see that they are really testing the boundaries of the cyber battlefield. And my fear is that what will happen next from them. Thank you.
Great points. And we'll come back to that last point and the use of surrogates and the escalation in just a few moments. I was very impressed with your declaratory policy against Sweden, and I think we'll see how that plays out during the course of this discussion. So we've gone from the Pacific to Europe. Now we'll bridge with a kind of a transatlantic discussion. Frank Kramer served as an Assistant Secretary of Defense. I had the privilege of serving under Frank several years ago. And Frank will kind of try to pull some threads together between the U.S. and allied positions.
Thanks very much, Bob, and let me also congratulate Catherine. I was with her at the beginning, and I think it's really fantastic what you've done, so really congratulations. I'm going to make 3 points at the beginning. I'll elaborate them, but if you can take away these 3 points, I think it'll be worthwhile. The first is that as we talk about deterrence, and I would include defense and resilience, as Bob indicated, different actions in different contexts of conflict and espionage and terrorism and crime really require different methodologies. So it's terribly important, I think, to specify the context in which you're talking about, whether it's deterrence or defense or resilience, because otherwise you'll lose track of where you're going. The second point is I don't think in a lot of the discussions, even today, there's not enough attention, I think, paid to the conflict situation. Starting, but not enough. But conflict is somewhat different, and it really requires the integration of the military and key critical infrastructures, and particularly the telecoms and the grid, and that there need to be actions taken in advance, and I'll in a cooperative or integrated way, and also to have operational capabilities that can work in a cooperative and integrated way. So you need an appropriate organizational structure, and you need you can call it a playbook or a doctrine or a way of working that you know in advance. The third takeaway I would ask you to think about is internationally. I think we need an operational structure, perhaps several, of like-minded countries who are really going to be able to work together, point one. And then point two, there are some critical infrastructures out there, like SWIFT, or for that matter, the ICANN servers, and some others, and we need to think about how to protect them if there really was a conflict. Now, that's not to say that espionage or crime or terrorism, which kind of overlaps some of those, are not terribly important, because they are, but there is a set of issues that I think need to be thought about that get not quite enough attention, except maybe at the Cyber Command. If you think about conflict, one of the other things I would say, and many people have said this, but I quite agree, it's very unlikely to have a so-called cyber war all by itself. I mean, in the conflict scenario, it would be cyber involved in a conventional conflict or a hybrid conflict. It's going to be part of a whole. For that, from the US perspective, or for any country who's our ally, we need to think about how to continue the approach that the DoD has taken, defense, offense, defending critical infrastructures. We need especially to work very closely with key critical infrastructures, and I was very interested to hear about what's happening in South Korea. I think that's a good way to go, but I would say even more. We really need to have the critical infrastructures, or the key ones, actually be compelled to take certain steps and to be compensated, because what they would be doing would be for national security reasons well beyond what a company would do for itself. So we need a legislative framework, and we need standards. We really are not going to be able to do it all by the government. We need help from the private sector. Admiral Rogers is talking about 6,400 people, if I remember the figure, 133 teams. Well, that's good, but it's not a whole lot. So I think we need to look, I've suggested something called certified active defenders, some way to bring in capabilities from the private sector. Secretary Carter talked recently about how guard units can bring in some very capable people. I think we need to think a lot about that. We need an operational structure within the United States that actually works with the private sector. I mentioned that already. And then as we go beyond the United States, I think we need to start to think about what I would call cyber extended deterrence. It's hard enough here in the US. There are a lot of countries who are close allies who do not have nearly the capabilities that we do. We need to be able to help them. In the nuclear arena, the United States provides extended deterrence. In the cyber arena, we could provide capabilities, training, work with them, and make sure that they have an effective comparable framework to the US. If they're capable enough, that's fine. But we shouldn't pretend that they are there now. One could start with NATO as a place to look at, but we certainly should start. We need to remember that defense requires offense. You're not going to get there without, especially in a conflict situation, some good offensive capability. Many of you, probably all of you, have seen the Secretary's statement that we're going to utilize cyber offense and the counter-ISIL coalition. Probably even more of you have seen the Deputy Secretary's statement that we're dropping cyber bombs. Whatever that means, we know that we're out there doing things. There are plenty of questions. Release authority, collateral consequences, use it for one time, lose it, but those can all be worked out. And the last point I would make on the like-minded point is there are institutions that have been created in relatively recent years. One's the Financial Stability Board, which works under the Basel agreements. It makes recommendations. It has, in effect, the G20 in it. Another was the Proliferation Security Initiative. These all came about in the last 10 or 15 years, and we need a comparable kind of set of institutions for cyber. Last point, as I said, it's not that espionage and the other things are unimportant. They're terribly important. And I would just say on the espionage side, we've taken some good steps in the U.S., but we need to increase the costs. More use of sanctions, forfeiture benefits if you took advantage of it, more indictments, more expulsions. We shouldn't just act as if it's okay. We spy, they spy, but there's no symmetry in international relations. We ought to try and stop what's going on. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Frank. Great perspective, really great perspective from everyone here. And I want to break with tradition, so if you have questions, please come to the mic and I'll make sure that they're addressed beginning now. While we're waiting for some people to come up, let me go back to Dean Cheng for a second. And I want to start with questions that have continually challenged me, and Melissa and I, Melissa Hathaway and I are currently on a defense science board group that are looking at this issue of deterrence, but specifically escalation dynamics, and the challenges we have in understanding what is escalatory, what is not. Frank brings up the offensive piece. Is that escalatory? Can it be used to be de-escalatory? What are the other kinds of ways that countries like China, especially in light of their different construct of deterrence, how do they look at escalation and this whole idea of what is considered escalatory, and how to and what should we be thinking about from the perspective of trying to bring some type of better understanding there?
Well, one of the interesting things is to note that Chinese writings in other domains, space, nuclear, for example, both clearly indicate that China does think about escalation. It thinks about escalatory ladders. But what fits into them becomes a sign of how differently they think about it. So, for example, demonstrations of cyber capability, I suspect, is in fact a signal intended as much for deterrence and coercion as it is an attempt to resolve problems. So if I can penetrate into your networks, one of the questions that inevitably will arise in your mind from the Chinese, I think the Chinese are hoping to do, is if you can penetrate to this level, where else are you rummaging around in the systems?
Right.
And so in the context of broader political questions, Taiwan, South China Sea, the hope is that this is the sort of thing that would either cause you to delay a response or more carefully consider a response, because again, at the end of the day, cyber in a sense doesn't matter. It is a terrestrial political issue that is being either coerced or dissuaded. So in this realm then, escalation becomes an interesting problem, because the other part here is we in the West are accustomed to thinking about crises as developing a momentum of their own, and therefore we want people to step away from a crisis as much as possible. But due to very different historical circumstances, I would suggest that the Chinese view crises almost like a rheostat, something that can be notched up and something that can be notched down. And that, again, is a fundamentally very different set of perspectives that holds really scary potentials in a political crisis where we may not realize that we're escalating, and they may see it as such, and vice versa. But more to the point is, we may be trying to diffuse a situation that may be interpreted as conceding rather than, let's all go back to our corners.
So where do you think we are, Dean, in terms of the dialogue on this, based on that perspective and currently the U.S.'s engagement with China?
I think that despite some of the comments we've heard here of how the Chinese have stepped down a lot of their cyber economic espionage, one, I will be blunt, color me extremely doubtful that that has been the case. Absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. But second of all is that, again, the Chinese view all of this informational aspect as contributing to comprehensive national power. It is building up the nation, not just the military. That means that I think that we are talking past each other, because at the end of the day, when your economy is starting to slow down, getting more information cheap becomes a higher priority, not a lower.
Okay. So before we go to the questions from the audience, other thoughts on the escalation dynamic, especially thinking about it from the Russian perspective?
I can fill in there. I think the Russians have similar methodology here, it's more about intimidation. And there's a saying about Russia, they are never so strong as they seem and never so weak as they seem. So it's a kind of start of thinking, what can they else do? And we have seen this with the submarine intrusions, etc. It's about delaying necessary national security decisions in a wartime situation until it's too late. And I think this is about the same principles here as well. It goes into our minds and we become self-destructive. So I think it's similarities in this case.
We go to a question from the audience. Go ahead. If you could just state your name and affiliation.
Compliment Mr. Limnéll on engaging in a little active measure related to the hockey game with your friend from Sweden. Now, you have to be careful about that. You're on the border of Russia and you're academic. You may be labeled an agent of Russia. But in Russian military doctrine, they have an understanding of the initial period of war. And under that concept, the initial period of war is to incapacitate as much as possible of the target country before he becomes aware that he's actually a target. I think that what we're seeing in your region, especially in the former Soviet Union, is in fact meeting that definition of the initial period of war. Concerning Mr. Limnéll's statement about the preponderance of hackers coming from the criminal sector, I would say that yes, we've seen how Russia has used criminal groups in Estonia in DDoS attacks. They've used it also in Georgia, but that they have their own very significant forces. And a matter of fact, Spetsnaz units now had incorporated cyber teams in the invasion of Crimea. So my question is this: looking at this threat landscape, and if we match their deployment of very, very sophisticated electronic weapon warfare equipment, the Kashuka-2, the Kashuka-4, all these other types of systems which directly seek to deny our battlefield management superiority, how close are we to, in fact, a real war? And in terms of your own countries, in Sweden, do you see, Russian intelligence is all about subversion. That's the heart and soul of the KGB or any service. Do you see internal subversion coming on with the rise of right-wing parties in your country?
Thank you. Thank you. So Lars and Jarno, why don't you take that question?
Thank you very much. Excellent and very challenging questions. Actually, these are the questions what, for example, in the Finland, Scandinavia, and Baltics, and many other European countries, we are a lot of thinking about nowadays. Starting about from that fact that too often we are trying to understand the Russian mentality and their decisions from the Western point of view, without understanding what is actually the mentality what they are having in the Russia. And at the moment, I think no one knows what will Russians to do next, what they will do next. I think that's a very honest answer. And that is the reason why I nowadays, like I mentioned, I think the unpredictable instability is the new normal in security where we have to live. And on the other hand, I have to say that what we are discussing a lot nowadays is that how these dichotomies, how I think it's the new human thoughts that we are trying to organize this world through dichotomies, that there is a war, peace, our side, their side, beginning, end. They are not working anymore. They are not reality in current security environment, what we are living at the moment. And I think this makes a little bit challenging, not only from the legislation point of view, but also from your response abilities point of view, how you live with this blurred dichotomies, security era. And I have to say that in many occasions at the moment, we know that there is ongoing pretty activist cyber activities from the Russia. But one of the key points is that some of them are very hard to observe what is really happening. And on the other hand, I think what we are discussing nowadays quite a lot is also the problematic when it seems pretty clear, now to be very honest again, that Russia is outsourcing their different cyber activities to these criminal groups and proxy groups. And if they get caught, like these Dukes, these hacker groups, which was conducting cyber espionage campaigns against the Western institutes, organizations, and think tanks more than 7 years. And if they get caught, then the government will have like a deniability that we don't have nothing to do with these groups. And this is a little bit problematic, how we respond to these actions.
Lars?
And two remarks here. First, about the criminal hackers and Russia's support from that criminal world. When it comes to the military, the electronic warfare, I think they have the competence residing within the military. When it comes to these kinds of actions, both as in Estonia and one attack we had recently on Swedish media that was supposedly came from Russia, you see the rental time for the botnets just go down like that. Okay, no spam for the Russian mobs. Okay, support the government for this time. So, but it's for certain time frames they can borrow and deal with that, but it's not a continuum, I think. But still, I don't think they're on the full chain of command in the military sense. The other thing you asked about support for different groups. This is about the strategic sixth generation warfare when the asymmetric warfare, which Russia delivers with active measures. Its strategic purpose is to break down the cohesion between the transatlantic alliance and cohesion within the EU and NATO. And with that, you have the energy weapon. The former German chancellor supports Gazprom, etc., and Nord Stream, a part of Putin's network. Didn't it go a little bit too fast when Germany said we should cut down our nuclear energy after Fukushima? How was the domestic support from the Green Party and the others? You had the Brits, Londongrad. You didn't. The British Lord came out in Guardian and said, yes, I was bought by Putin. And that was the one reason it was stated that the Brits didn't prosecute Litvenko's murder. You had a Mistral case with Hollande in France. They tried to find avenues in this case, and they support extremists to the right or the left. It doesn't matter as long as they're against the transatlantic alliance and will break cohesion. And we have seen that in Sweden as well for the right-wing side especially, but they are marginalized. But you see, the left is quite marginalized as well, but it exists. It's a part of the strategy.
Just a very short comment, because this is something that I have been thinking last 2 weeks. After your Defense Secretary Ashton Carter gave the first wartime assignment for the Cyber Command here in the United States, and afterwards it has been a lot of in the news that now you are starting to dropping cyber bombs and starting offensive measures also in the cyber battlefield, as we heard from the Admiral Rogers also. I think this is one sign also that offensive cyber activities are coming to be more acceptable in the international relations as part of your daily activities in a way. And it doesn't have to be a wartime to use these offensive capabilities. And I think these kind of signs might be a little bit dangerous from the Scandinavian point of view, if this becomes easy and acceptable to use these kind of offensive capabilities, because we have one of the most capable cyber nations just next to us, and of course they are following the same situation.
Some thoughts on this?
I want to go to the last question that you asked, which is how close are we to war? One of the things I think we need to be clear on is that wherever we thought we started a few years ago, we're much closer than we were. So, for example, the United States and Europe have put on substantial sanctions with respect to Russia because of what went on in Ukraine. The United States has significantly plussed up its activities for NATO. The President has proposed, and as best I understand, the Congress is absolutely going to approve the so-called European Reassurance Initiative, where we maintain 4 brigades at all times in Europe. So I think that one of the questions now is, whereas before we were trying, if you will, to reassure our allies, et cetera, now we're really trying to deter the Russians, which involves pushing back. There was a time a couple months ago when Russia sent some cruise missiles long distance into Syria, and that was seen as a signal. Probably was. Showed their capabilities. What the Secretary has done, what Secretary Carter's done by saying we're going to use offensive capability against ISIL, it's a signal also because it can go multiple places. So I think that what you're seeing is the United States is significantly increasing its deterrent activities. I believe there's a so-called Warsaw Summit coming up in a couple month and a half. I think you'll see that NATO does it also, and so I don't think we're actually close to war, but we're close enough that we have to think about it. And then your point about some of these activities being, I don't know if you use these words or not, preparation of the battlefield, I quite agree with you, and we need to take steps to defuse those and limit the possibility it can be used that way.
So great conversation. I think it really goes back to the escalation discussion of it, and whether or not what Frank discussed or what Jarno and Lars were discussing, these things that the Russians are doing and others are doing in this space, are they the new flexible deterrent options that we should be thinking about from a military parlance standpoint? And are they effective? Are they escalatory or de-escalatory? And I think that's a question still out on the table. Let's go to another question.
Good afternoon, Mike Coombs with Global Cyber Strategies. Picking up on a number of points that have been discussed today, we've heard about a range of actors and deterrence. We've tended to focus this discussion here more on the national state level, which is appropriate. We have talked about the criminal element. But if we're going to talk about true national deterrence, we also have to take into account the economic aspects of the nation. And so deterring the criminals as well as the hacktivists is equally important. And the best way to do that is to be resilient. And this was hinted at in the discussions earlier from Korea, Sweden, and Finland. And Sweden obviously working on Total Defense 2. I've actually seen elements of Total Defense 1 in Sweden, and it was quite robust so they could be resilient. Those tunnels and caves in the granite were quite robust. We're not serious about robustness and resilience in the United States to the degree we probably should be. If we were more resilient to where any attack or intrusion or espionage attempt or theft of personal data for monetary means was rebuffed or minimized to be inconsequential, wouldn't that be better deterrence and a better expenditure than talking about a red herring of active defense and cyber militias, which could be extremely problematic?
Thanks, Mike. So I think the question of broad topic of resilience, the question is how resilience relates to the overall dialogue on deterrence, and what the U.S. is doing or not doing vis-a-vis other countries, highlighting some of the perspectives out of the Scandinavian countries. why don't we talk about both aspects, right? So let's talk about national perspectives on resilience. You heard some from Won Yi about South Korea. Why don't we pick up there? How do the South Koreans think about resilience as an element of deterrence? Won Yi.
Well, when we talk about North Korea, they only have, what, 100 some IP addresses that are connected to the internet. I think they have applied for it about 4 years ago, and I don't know how many IP addresses that are assigned to them at the moment. But all the North Korean attacks are coming from other countries, using other countries. When we look at the attacks that are coming into Korea, number one is coming from China, number two is coming from United States. And when we talk about the offensive side of active defense, we are supposed to be attacking China and United States, who are partners in cybersecurity aspects. So we have to be really careful on offensive side of active defense, because it's most likely that the attacking IP addresses that you detect is going to be hopping points, not original attacking points. And North Korea, the way they earn foreign money is to sell their labors. And recently, they are selling their computer scientists, programmers to overseas and collect money from their laborers. And when they are about to attack South Korea, they call in all these programmers back to their country to initiate attack. So once they call in, they have about 3 or 4 months preparation times and then initiate the attack. So you don't know where the attack is actually coming from. And that's the mind that you have to approach. And therefore, rather than offensive capabilities, that's more of a military side, not the private sectors. So rather than think about offensive side, hardening our servers and improving our capabilities and raising human resources, and thereby tire North Korea out and stop their attacks. Recently, there's been a lot of attacks that are coming into from North Korea. However, their pattern has been changed. They're not attacking directly to the target sites, but rather they're attacking maintenance company or information security companies that are using patching systems, or developing information IT companies who are developing softwares. They steal certificates, code signing certificates, and passwords, and send out malicious code. So we are mainly focused on detecting malicious code at the moment. For example, they're using servers with weaknesses, and they implant malicious code so that those malicious code will be downloaded to the people who visit their websites. There are 2.8 million websites in Korea, and we have a system that visits these 2.8 million websites to find malicious code or link that links to the malicious code. And we visit those sites 3 times a day, 2.8 million .kr websites. And those are the systems that we invested at the moment, and we continue to develop more of a defensive and detective mechanisms.
So good. So a few points from your perspective, Won-Yi, that we really need to think about. One is going back to the escalatory discussion, the potential for what offensive capability or active defense does with regards to escalation, at least confusion. And then the issue of resiliency, I'd like to, again, tease that out a little bit more. I think it's an important element, as Mike indicated. I think, as we heard today, there's different perspectives on where we should focus resiliency. How do we prioritize assets? How do other countries prioritize assets? Which really helps us in our definition of of discussions of critical infrastructure protection. So what I'd like to do is, before we go to the next question from the audience, is talk a little bit more about resiliency and from the different national perspectives. Dean, do you have a comment?
Not from a Chinese perspective, but more from an American one.
Yep, go ahead.
One thought here about resilience in terms of a mental model might be the Civilian Reserve Air Fleet, where the U.S. government has paid various airlines and package moving companies, UPS, et cetera, to basically strengthen the floors of their large body transports so that in time of war they can be used to shuttle military equipment. It obviously imposes a cost on the aircraft's performance, increases fuel consumption, and so craft investments were seen as a public-private partnership for time of war. And so something to think about might be whether that would be the justification, mentally speaking. And interestingly, craft call-up had 3 phases. The first one being purely presidential, a limited number, and then you would escalate requiring congressional approval. And again, you might think of that as a basis for improving resiliency. I have a question for Frank, and this goes to the issue of resiliency and deterrence. And what my question, I guess, is, imagine you were perfectly resilient in the sense of you had either protected or you had backups. And so an attack upon you, in a sense, doesn't have that much of an effect. If we were attacked under those circumstances, would that, in a sense, it causes retaliation to become more politically problematic because, well, nothing happened. Now, if somebody fired a missile at the United States and the missile malfunctioned, no one would say, oh, well, you know, it's all good. You know, LA is still there, so we don't have to worry about it. But cyber here, it would be, you know, I don't think anyone would say that, and you would retaliate. So the question is, if you had resiliency, what would be the argument about retaliation at that point? And would you be able to politically sell retaliation if the cyber attack failed due to our resiliency? In a weird way, it almost makes you want to be less perfect in your resiliency, it seems.
I'm always in favor of being perfect, so. First of all, just to fight the hypothetical, as I said, I think any serious attack will be in the context of an overall geopolitical circumstance. So the likelihood of a pure cyber attack, I think, is, if we're not talking about espionage and the like, is low. I do not see that that's the way the war starts. It could be part of the way the war starts, for sure, as was pointed out earlier, but there'll be a lot more going on. I am of the view that if someone picks up a gun and shoots at you, if he misses, that doesn't mean he gets to just walk away. So to be absolutely clear, I would say yes, we should appropriately, to use your word, retaliate, take appropriate steps. And then there's always a decision, which are what are the appropriate steps? You know, going to war, starting conflicts, or not. You know, you don't do that easily. But I would not say that even though we had the perfect shell or the perfect comeback capability, that means somebody gets a free pass. At least that's my view.
We're gonna continue with the resiliency conversation, but I want to take a question from the audience now. Yep.
Hi there. I'm Teresa Hitchens, and I'm a senior research scholar at the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Maryland. And I want to thank the panel. It's been a very interesting conversation. I have a question about what's called positive deterrence in deterrence theory. And this is when you provide potential adversaries or potential bad actors with assurances or some sort of mutual assurances to as a way of stopping them from doing bad things. In other words, you give rewards for good behavior and you know, as part of a package. You do that in child rearing too. You don't just have punishments, you give rewards for good behavior. So I would be interested to hear what the panel thinks about that in the context of setting international norms of behavior as work is ongoing, both at the UN and at the OSCE on these issues. I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts about positive deterrence as part of that norm building process.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me just start, and then I'll turn to others. One of the dimensions that I watch over in the Pacific region, again, is some of the work that's being done with businesses and with countries practicing continuity of business and continuity of government, especially on the global transaction platform. And I find that, useful from a resiliency perspective, but in the context of the question, I think potentially a positive deterrent as you think about countries that are potentially engaging in malicious activity that want to be part of a global transaction platform in a more meaningful way. So any thoughts with regards to either that point or other points? Yeah, go ahead.
Just on the question, which I think is a good question, one of the, and it must have been spoken about earlier today, but I just wasn't here for the norms discussion, but in the UN, in the so-called GGE, group of global experts, there have been some agreements with respect to what norms are, including not attacking critical infrastructure and the like. But I think what one sees in practice is that although there was agreement with respect to norms, that a lot of systems are penetrated still. And the penetration doesn't have that final, turn into an attack, but they're ready. So one of the real questions is whether or not we can do things in the cyber arena that have practical impact as opposed to declaratory policy. Now, I do think that there's value nonetheless in what was done at the GGE, but it's more, in my view, value bringing the like-minded countries together, and then and the like-minded for me would include, for example, the so-called Five Eyes. It would include some of the NATO allies, close partners like Sweden and Finland, Republic of Korea, and Japan. Because if we see intrusions in the wrong way that are getting right up to the edge, then we ought to be able to get together and say to ourselves, well, we're going to take steps to try and enforce that norm. And if you didn't have the norm, it would make it harder to create the geopolitical circumstance in which there was a willing to enforce. So I would be very happy at some point to talk to you about more, what would work from the positive side. But I think they have, it's limited right now, in my view.
Right. Just building off that point and then open it up for other comments from others is taking norms to another level where you see enforcement of norms, especially in cybercrime. I think one of the things that should be a positive deterrent is what Interpol is doing in the bad botnet campaigns, right? In terms of taking down bad bots, building coalitions of interested partners, that should be considered as something that is not only increasing the resilience overall, but a way of signaling to other countries, be a part of this, right? Bad bots are not good in China, they're not good in other countries, and so let's get together and try to attack that problem. Yeah, Lars.
I think this is very important, especially when we talked about the Russian approaches to rely on the mob and the mafia, as we saw during the Estonia case, etc. It was the same actors who normally sell fake passports doing child porn, etc. You could go the criminal way to prosecute them and find avenues for that instead of just showing the attribution to other, just to get them to intelligence means or national security means. Take them from that avenue instead. And the EC3, Europol's crime center, I think if you start engaging with them much more, etc., you can get rid of a lot of problems and nuisances and concentrate maybe on the big issues. But you pull the plug a little bit for the bad actors here because they're relying on the same platforms. So I think this is a, if you take down the criminal side, you reduce the overall problem largely.
Go ahead, Jarno.
Very good point. And very shortly, as we all know, cybersecurity is a team sport. As my opinion, not even the United States can handle this issue by itself. This is a question of the partners and importance of the partners. Likely we consider very strongly in Finland that we have to have strong partners in order to be a strong player in this field when we are talking about the cyber. But at the same time, I have to say that one of the problematics to trying to reach this positive interpretation of this cyber future is that, for example, by my experience, even with the closest allies within the NATO, there's a lot of suspicion at the moment. We don't actually so much share information, what kind of capabilities we have, how advanced capabilities we have created. And I think if we are trying to get better shared deterrence, this will require later transparency regarding to the especially offensive capabilities. But I think this is once more a good example how we are just leaving the early stages to create these kind of policies and cooperation methods, even between the closest allies.
Thank you. Very interesting panel so far, thank you. Once again, Patrick Maldre from Estonia, head of the CIPA Cyber Defense Initiative. So I've been diplomatic as a result of my background throughout the course of the day, but I agree with many of your assessments that Russia does indeed use offensive cyber capabilities as part of its foreign and security policy. Cyber threat actors with connections to Russia, including but not limited to APT-28, APT-29, Snake Tail Ouroboros, Red October / Cloud Atlas, Sandworm Team, Energetic Bear, Operation Patal Express, and so on, do target NATO and EU countries, begin their operations, and usually show their first capabilities in the area of Central and Eastern Europe, and ultimately end up usually threatening advanced Western European countries and the United States. This has been the case with almost all of these cyber threat actors. We can't, as far as I know, or at least using open source information, trace these back to, department this or that of the GRU or the SVR or the FSB. But when we look at the fact that the 7 years of malware code development for a particular cyber threat actor takes place in Moscow time between 9 and 6 and usually stops during Russian holidays. When we look at the target sets, including parliaments, ministries of foreign affairs, defense, research institutions of Western countries and other Russian strategic adversaries, we see a pretty clear pattern here, right? What can we do? What measures can countries take to deter Russia from these kinds of activities? The White House has recently put out a deterrence policy that specifies some of these measures, right? These include law enforcement measures, including the recent indictments of Chinese and Iranian threat actors. This shows attribution capabilities, right? We've also used or threatened sanctions to some degree, right? And that got China to the table. What else can we do? Openness in terms of offensive cyber capabilities, maybe not disclosing, the exact code, but demonstrations, including Operation Aurora. Public demonstrations of offensive cyber capabilities is one route, right? Perhaps we need to move to stronger political and diplomatic attribution. Who here doubts that Russia was behind the 2007 cyber attacks in Estonia? Who here doubts that the 2008 attacks in Georgia served Russian strategic interests? Who here doubts that the 2015 Ukraine grid attacks served Russian strategic interests? Why does it take us 7 years to come to this consensus and this conclusion? Perhaps it might be useful to be more open, more straightforward, direct about this. And the same goes for perhaps the offensive cyber operations of our own countries. If we bring this out into the open, if we talk more about it, we might be able to achieve greater stability in this sphere. So I ask you guys, what else, what measures can we take? And another one is in the run-up to or during the NATO summit in Wales in 2014, President Obama came to speak in Estonia talking about NATO solidarity, collective defense, and so on. In the last few days of the NATO summit in Wales in 2014, the Russian FSB conducted a cross-border operation involving electronic warfare and border guard units to kidnap a NATO counterintelligence agent, presumably as a sign of the capabilities of the Russian special forces, right? And as a message to NATO, probing the boundaries of what will constitute a NATO response and what won't, right? So what is stopping Russia from doing this in cyberspace right now? Is there an incentive to provoke NATO in cyberspace before the Warsaw Summit? And in the same way that the Russian Air Force constantly buzzes our borders, buzzes NATO ships, and so on, and conducts cross-border operations. And what exactly, can we do to disincentivize Russia from conducting these kinds of activities? Thank you.
That's a great question. Really, really good commentary. So let me go to the panel members here, and then I might provide a comment. Frank, you want to discuss first?
First of all, I think your descriptions are pretty accurate, so I agree with them. I think that we've taken a certain amount of time since, I would say, Putin's Munich 2007 speech to realize that he means what he says. He's pretty clear what he's saying. And we are, in fact, substantial. When I say we, both the United States and our allies and our close partners are, in fact, building up defense capabilities, not as fast as perhaps some people would like, but really have turned things around. I think it is a tremendous mistake to pull cyber out as a separate arena and not look at the entirety of the geopolitical and military context. Not that one doesn't need to have cyber capabilities and work in that arena as part of it, but you have to look at the overall. I'm going to repeat what I said before, which is I think the European Reinsurance Initiative, where the U.S. has put $3.4 billion down, quadrupled what it was going to spend, what it did spend last year, and will maintain significantly more forces in Europe, is a big deal. And I expect that at Warsaw you're going to have comparable sets of actions by Europeans. So that with respect to a Russian military action against NATO countries, Article 5 type sets of activities, I think the Russians will know and do know that the United States and our allies will be prepared to fight. And I include some of the countries that up to now have been somewhat more reluctant. I think there's a substantial change. It doesn't mean that an earlier part of your conversation was the espionage part and the like. I would just say again that I think we the U.S., but I think other countries ought to also have greater use of sanctions. We ought to coordinate those. I think we should all agree to the extent that there is, and one of the earlier discussions, questions went to the point of benefits, criminal benefits. If there is a benefit, that we should look to forfeitures. I think more indictments are warranted. I know that the people will likely not come to U.S. courts to be put in jail, but I think they are a great signal. And I think we should not shy away from expulsions. And there may be some other things to do. So I would encourage more commentary along the lines that you said, and to try and keep developing a menu of options, recognizing that we have now an adversary that puts NATO at the top of its threat list and is taking a lot of sets of activities in the Baltic Sea and elsewhere that makes it a really difficult problem that we have to focus on.
Dean, you have one?
I'd like to follow that up by noting that for both Russia and China, these are countries that face multiple threat axes. So when we think of NATO, we think of NATO as a semi-monolithic entity. But it is, over 25 countries that are allied together, each with different capabilities. If you are looking out from Moscow, however, NATO may be at the top of the list, but it's not the only one. You have China, you have Japan, you have Central Asia, you have the Middle East. This raises the other, to follow up again on Frank's comments, is to what extent are we perhaps both overly focused on cyber for cyber as opposed to diplomatic and other, but also Europe as the main focus? To what extent, given the competition, for example, between Russia and China for influence in Central Asia, does the opportunity to present information to relevant leaders in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or elsewhere potentially complicate Russian calculations and force them to allocate more resources, more than anything else, away from Europe towards a part of the world that, for the moment at least, they seem to be able to focus on just one potential competitor, namely China? To what extent, and this of course is much more complicated for the United States, perhaps somewhat less complicated for Europe, is China a potential counterweight to Russia and vice versa? To what extent would being able to assist Japan and South Korea, which also face Russian intrusions, a means of basically signaling Moscow that, yes, you can intrude, you can do various bad things. We can make your life more complicated across all 11 time zones that your country spans.
I think that is a very relevant question. And I have been asking many, many times the same question, that how long we let this continue, to be very, very straight. And I think in Europe, in the United States, as my opinion, we are hoping that things will change better. There will be a good solution in Ukraine this year or maybe next year, and then we can forget this incident and continue as a good partners. My prediction is that that will not happen. This situation in Ukraine, in the Baltic Sea area, in Europe, in this unpredictable instability as security paradigm, will not change in coming years. And of course, it's very important, as we all know, to continue discussions with the Russians and with the others and continue this dialogue. But at the moment, it seems that putting sanctions and saying politically that this is not a good thing, that's not enough. And I think we have to, in Western countries, in some stage, to think a little bit more stronger responses for these actions.
Lars, go ahead.
Let me just hang on here. These kind of approach and common assessment of Russia, in this case within NATO and our partners, I think it's very important that it will be you have a common understanding and keep that tight. With the reassurance package for the Eastern Europe and Baltic is a very good sign. But when you see Victoria Nuland and others go out and talking about separate status for the Donbass, etc., that causes some uneasiness in that case. So it's very important to keep the alliance and the partners united in the whole world concept to keep up the pressure here. So I think that's a strategic thing. So you can't drive wedges between partners and different countries here.
My personal viewpoint on this, I had the opportunity to negotiate bilaterally with the Russians all the way back in the first cyber arms control discussion back in '98. We've got a lot of options. We've been thinking about a lot of options. It is, I think, a broader context than just cyber. But I think our options menu needs to turn to coordinated action. And there's an opportunity with Warsaw. There's been other opportunities, but there is certainly an opportunity with Warsaw. And I think we need to we need to move in the directions that have been suggested around the table. So appreciate your question. Thanks. One last question here.
Hi, my name is Kazuo Noguchi from Hitachi America.
Yeah.
My question is short. What kind of the expectation you may have for critical infrastructure operators and manufacturers, which are all private sectors these days, in terms of making the deterrence working well? Is that something investment to make the wall so that it's very difficult to penetrate, or private, public information sharing? What are your thoughts?
Anyone want to start? Lars, go ahead.
I have one pitch here I always try to put forward. I think this work with the cyber insurances that was come on in 1999, and then went down the drain, and now came up again some years ago and started with Progress, CGI and others, would be an interesting idea to pursue further. Because if you get real cyber insurances with independent, if you should have such insurance, you must have this kind of doing red team tests, etc., to fulfill the conditions, information assurance manuals. And at the same moment, you get a value of all the costs and risks, which otherwise are not valued. It becomes a CEO question instead of CIO question. And that's why then you create robustness through an internal control and governance system, through the accountant and the board, etc., and release the government to some thinking about ordinary stuff which the taxpayers shouldn't pay. And you just can allocate the taxpayers' money to the collective good for the threats which companies can't foresee or are outside their business optimum. But the path of cyber insurances, I wish that could be pursued further and developed further.
I spend a bit of time in this space working in the private sector with a lot of critical infrastructure service providers in the United States, and in countries that have this relationship where most of the critical infrastructure is controlled and managed in the private sector. I think from the standpoint of deterrence and national security, it is a public-private partnership. My perspective really on public-private partnerships revolves around 4 ideas. The first is we need to identify champions in spaces, right? We see that in successful partnerships that we've talked about today. The financial services, we have identified government and industry champions working together. We need to think then secondly about what are the goals that we're trying to achieve. You just can't say broad resiliency. I think you have to narrow that to a specific issue, a problem that you're trying to solve, as opposed to these platitudes that sometimes we talk about. The third is, I think we have to start with, yes, common language, but drive to standards, common standards, because we have to create an element of interoperability and efficiency in the partnership. If we do that, thirdly, then the fourth point is, I think we avoid the issues of public-private partnerships that start and fizzle out. We actually create partnerships that have enduring values, and we should be thinking about this as a long-term campaign, where we are incented together to move together, to create a much stronger critical infrastructure that increases business and increases national security. Other thoughts? Okay. All right. We're about ready to wrap up. I'm just going to go quickly around the panel, see if there's any final comments that anyone would like to make. No? Okay, Catherine, with that, I want to say thank you to everyone on the panel.
All right, thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you all for actually staying. This is a very long day, and I always appreciate the end of each day. Once a year, I look out, and I'm like, wow, these are the true believers, those that I know your faces, and I thank you. This was one of my favorite panels, and I want to thank everybody who came from afar, especially our international travelers. It means a lot that you took the time out of your own personal life to come here and spend some time with us. I want to say thanks to you guys for ending the day after being here for a long day. A number of years ago, a gentleman at DOD asked me to come and speak to him about what I was doing in cyber at Georgetown. And he gave me this idea. He asked me, what do you think is important? And I said, well, there's a lot of things, but certainly international engagement is going to be needed in this space, and I just can't believe people are doing it. And he said, why don't you run with that idea? And I said, sure, I'll just start a conference. That gentleman was Bob Butler. And so while he thanks me, you should be really thanking him. And Frank has stood by me, as he said, every year, as well as many of you guys. Every year I meet new friends, I wrap people in to come back. I also work year-round. After one day of this conference, I work for the rest of the year with many of you and friends on writing and publishing, and also working with the diplomats who I had a window into last week. I have a newfound deep respect for all diplomats that are negotiating in this area of cyber. For a week, I sat in Geneva and I said, I could not do this job for the life of me, with the Russian ambassador and the Chinese representatives and the Germans, and everybody was there. And I just scratched my head and said, wow, this is a hard job. But thank you. I want to thank all the students that helped us. I want to thank Rachel for being here all day. And Juliana, thank you very much. There's some people in the back that are not even going to hear this, but I want to say thank you to Allison and Caroline as well. But thank you guys for coming. And seems like we're doing this as an annual thing, so we're going to keep going, and next year will be the 7th year. Reach out to me anytime. Always want new people to be involved, but thanks for coming and enjoying a day with me. Take care.